Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video 151, the Church of Adam loosely based on early 20th century occultism. I would stretch this further than that too. If you're looking at sort of the occultism, we're talking the end of the 1800s up through like the 1930s and 40s into kind of the early atomic era. If you read some of the literature from that time period, some of the more out there stuff that deals with the sort of true occult pseudo-scientific feel of the day, what you get is a lot of material that really does try to overlap and coordinate the concept of radiation in some form or another, and of course how it was understood changed over that period of time somewhat. That was definitely associated with magical power, with the occult in general. The idea was that it was like some sort of cosmic power that at the time was not fully understood. It was an energy, and people were talking about, oh, well, maybe this is why there are ghosts. Maybe this is how magic works, or something like that. In the more mundane atomic period we have now, you know, the hydrogen bomb period, you get a general absence of this. The radiation goes from being something that's seen as vaguely medicinally relevant and interesting, like an interesting phenomenon whose dangers aren't fully understood, especially with regards to weapons building, and is seen as more positive. The theosophists remark upon it. Occultism for beginners actually speaks of radiation, of the particle types and sort of their energetic, their spiritual significance at the time. This is I think that was 1902 or 1903 that was actually written. It was before 1920, certainly. And then later on, as the weaponized side of radiation, of potentially, fissionable material becomes apparent, then the spiritual side of the atomic is the apocalyptic. People start fitting it in with Revelation, with the idea of wormwood. People fit it in with Ragnarok. Oh, well, then, the nuclear winter, the Fimble winter. Oh, it just makes sense. And you get more of a massively negative spin on the whole concept. The idea that these weapons are going to end the world. This, depending on who you ask, brings about a spiritual revolution of sorts. Like, oh yeah, all the dross has been purged. Now we can go back to being, like, primitive, and we can be shaman or something like that. Or it talks about, well, we're going to end the world and God's going to send us all to hell because, we're just such evil people blowing one another up here. I think the latter probably more common than the former generally. Certainly, the rise of the atomic era really does influence Christianity as it's practiced in the West. It certainly influences all other religions that are associated with it right now. Now that India is an atomic power, not a modern nuclear power, but it has hundreds of weapons. It certainly appears to be influencing sort of the Hindu nationalism that you're seeing there, as well as their disputes with Pakistan, a majority Islamic nation, also with atomic weapons. It's influencing the cultures of these countries, and culture and religion overlap. So the culture of the early 1900s and sort of the late 1800s is when it starts. Saying, oh, well, this radium stuff is pretty cool. Let's sit in a radioactivity-filled cave. It's probably medicinal. It has something to do with the spiritual world. Look, there are different kinds of particles that show different energetic capabilities, and this is a statement on human spirituality. Now, the overlap with, like, the Church of Adam. When we're talking about, I know that's from Fallout lore, and it's a totally fictional group, but it's actually fairly apt. It's actually... you could deem it a group of theosophists circa the early 1900s sitting around remarking upon the spiritual significance of fission or something along those lines. It's actually a pretty close fit. Again, Dower's Occultism for Beginners. He was a theosophist. When I first encountered the book, I had already encountered Fallout 3. And I was surprised. I'm like, oh, is this like, am I reading a Church of Adam manuscript or something like that? I've got a physical copy of that, and I thought it was interesting. And it goes into more than that. It also speaks of the cell. Of course, at the time, the understanding of atoms as we have it today was lesser as well. but it speaks of cells, biology, and general morphology. All of these different sciences for that period of occultism were considered important. It was considered important in the way of synchronicity, to look at the overlap between concepts, even in an abstract way, between science and the more spiritual, to derive something from science. And this is an old practice. It's not just New Agery. It was taken to the level of New Agery, and especially now, I would say even further, with people are like, oh, they obsess over numbers or something like that. They think there's some mystic significance to everything around them in the world. Back then, it was perhaps a little bit more deep intellectually, I think. And even if you go back to like the rational movement of the more early 1800s, even in some cases the Enlightenment, you get this sort of stuff. I've got an astrological hand guide, sort of the earliest pre-fortune telling work. I think it's the progenitor of like the Norwood Gypsy stuff and the Universal Fortune Teller and the Shakespeare's Oracle and stuff like that, and Napoleon's Oraculum. All this stuff, I think, branches off this one work. I haven't found anything older than it that mentions these similar things, sometimes verbatim, like they were copied from it into these other fortune-telling works. And it's like, it's an Enlightenment-era work talking about the importance of astrology and all these other things over man's life. A connection was made between the movement of cosmic things and the world, the mundane, very anthropic world of man. The same thing happened with radiation. The same thing happens with the atomic. And then later on it takes on, again, that greater significance. Much later, you're talking about sort of the doomsday cults, or, it even affects, like, the true New Agery. Oh, don't worry about this atomic war stuff. This bullshit can happen all at once. The UFOs will come and save us, sort of like Heaven's Gate or something like that. Oh, the world will pass away. We'll be fine. We'll be up in the mothership. Something like that. Human spirituality, I think, has gotten steadily more screwy since the atomic era began. But it doesn't begin just with that. It really begins with the apparent innate inclination of some or all people to make connections between the more observable secular side and what spiritual statements can be made about it. So when you have somebody talking about these different particles and these different sort of types of radioactive material and the potential at the time medical uses of radiation and making spiritual statements on it, it's not actually that odd, and it really is a lot like some cult that feels positively towards radiation, feels positively towards atoms glow and things of that nature. I just thought that would be interesting to talk about. Again, if you read Occultism for Beginners by Dower, this is one of the earliest works I bothered to edit because it was so interesting. It really does speak to some small degree of detail on the subject. You'd be surprised what they were saying about radiation at the turn of the century. The last century, not even this one. It's a very interesting work. Dower was an interesting man. He wrote other works as well. And you have this inclusion of the overlap between what would have been by many people considered, well, it's just science. It's just, radiation exists. Cells exist. What more am I saying about this? The overlap between those concepts and the spiritual realm among some of these movements at the time that they gave them this greater significance. It's an interesting topic to think about. That's about all. Peace out.